Okay, lovelies. New book for January. You don't have to be evil to work here, but it helps. Another J.W. Wells and Co. book, written by Tom Holt and read by Ing Arnadine. Well, me. Anyway, if you enjoy my reading, please hit that notification bell. It really does help the channel. Please follow if you'd like to, share if you'd want to, and if you enjoy these, please let me know. That'd be awesome. So I hope you're having a good day, and let's get into it. Chapter 1. 3 weeks, and still nobody had the faintest idea who they were. There were rumours, of course. They were Americans, Germans, Russians, Japanese, an international consortium based in Ulaanbaatar, the Barclay brothers, Rupert Murdoch. They were white knights, asset strippers, the good guys, the bad guys, maybe even Kaugachia integrated circuits operating through a network of shells and holding companies designed to bypass the US antitrust legislation. Presumably, the partners had some idea who they were, but Mr. Wells hadn't been seen around the office in weeks. Mr. Suslevich burst into tears if anybody raised the subject, and nobody was brave and stupid enough to ask Mr. Tanner. "We bloody well ought to be able to figure it out for ourselves," declared Connie Schwartz-Alberich from Mineral Rights, not for the first time. "I mean, it's a small industry. The number of players is strictly limited. Only," she pulled a face, "only I've been ringing round. People I know in other firms, and everybody seems just as confused as we are. You'd have thought someone would have heard something by now, but apparently not. It's bloody frustrating." Thoughtful silence. A soft grunt of disgust from Peter Melsnick as half of his dunk digestive broke off and flopped into his tea. "I still reckon it's the Germans," said Benny Shumway, chief cashier. "Zauberkraft worker, UMG. They're the only ones big enough in Europe." "Unlikely," muttered the thin-faced new girl from entertainment and media, whose name nobody could remember. "I worked for UMG for 18 months. It's not their style." For some reason, the new girl's statements were always followed by an awkward silence, as though she'd just said something rude or obviously false. Unfortunate manner was the generally held explanation, but it didn't ring quite true. Peter Melsnick was on record as saying that she gave him the creeps. Coming from Peter, that was quite an assertion, but even he was at a loss as to explain exactly why. "I don't think it's anybody in the business," the new girl went on. "I think it's someone completely new that none of us has ever heard of. Possibly," she added after a moment's reflection, "Romanians. It's just a feeling I have." "I don't care who it is," Connie Schwartz-Alberich lied, "so long as it's not Harrison's. I couldn't stand the thought of having to take orders from that smug git Tony Harrison. He was a junior clerk here once, believe it or not. Years ago." Benny Shumway frowned. "Is that right?" Connie nodded. "It was just before I got sent out to the San Francisco office. He started off in Mineral Rights, same as everybody. He was an obnoxious little prick even then." Benny shrugged. "I don't think it's Harrison's," he said. "I happen to know they're in deep trouble right now. In fact, if it wasn't for the bank bailing them out—" He paused and frowned. "Anyhow, it's not them. Not," he added, standing up, "that it's something we can do anything about. And so far, admit it, they've not been so bad." Connie snorted. Peter scowled. The new girl was staring in rapt fascination at a picture on the wall. She did things like that. Benny glanced at his watch and sighed. "Time I wasn't here," he said. Left alone with 4 empty mugs and her thoughts, Connie tried to get back to the job in hand, but she couldn't concentrate. Benny had been right, of course. Whoever they were, they'd bought the company, and she and her colleagues went with the rest of the inventory. The desks, chairs, VDUs and stationery at valuation, it'd be entirely unrealistic to classify them as part of the goodwill. It was, she couldn't help thinking, a funny old way to run a civilization, but she'd become reconciled over the years to the fact that her consent was neither sought nor required. 5 more years to retirement. A long time to hang on, but at her age she had no choice. Whoever they were, accordingly, they had her heart and mind. Just for curiosity, she turned her head and looked at the picture, the one that had apparently fascinated the new girl. Poole Harbour, in watercolours, by Connie's brother Norman. There was something odd about that girl, but for the life of her, Connie couldn't quite pin down what it was. She picked up a stack of 6x8 black and white glossy prints. Most people would have been hard-pressed to say whether they were modern art, the latest pictures of the surface of the moon sent back by the space shuttle, close-ups of wood grain, or the inside view of a careless photographer's lens cap. She picked one off the top of the stack, closed her eyes, and rested the palm of her hand on it. Harrison's, she thought, and scowled. The phone on Connie's desk rang, startling her out of her vague recollections of Tony Harrison as a junior clerk, asking her in crimson embarrassment where the men's bugs were. As she lifted her hand off the photograph to answer it, she noticed a faint cloud of moisture on the surface of the print. Ah, she thought, I must be worried. Cassie for you? God, Connie sighed. All right. The usual click, and then, Connie? Cassie dear, I'm stuck. What again? Connie closed her eyes. I will not be brusque. I was young and feckless once. No, she reflected. I was young, but I didn't keep getting stuck all the bloody time. Listen, she said pleasantly. It's just a tiny bit awkward at the moment. Do you think you could possibly hang on there till lunch? No, Cassie squeaked. Look, I'm stuck. You've got to... All right, Connie sighed. Tell me where you are and I'll come and get you. She wrote down the directions on her scratch pad, the corners and edges of which she'd earlier embellished with graceful doodles of entwined sea serpents. Please hurry, Cassie pleaded urgently. Sorry to be a pain, but... Be with you as soon as I can, Connie said, and put the phone down. Bugger, she thought. It was, of course, only natural that the younger woman should have chosen her as her guide, role model, and mentor. Even so, she glanced down at the pile of prints. She could always take them home and do them this evening. Wasn't as if she had anything else planned. Somehow, that reflection brought her little comfort. She stood up, took down her coat from behind the door, and left the room. To get out of 70 St Mary Axe without A, official leave, B, being seen by Mr Tanner, assuming you're starting from the 2nd floor back, you'd have to sneak across the landing, into the computer room to the rear staircase. This will bring you out in the long corridor that curls round the ground floor like a python, and of course you'll pass Mr Suslovich's door on your way. But that's all right, because Kaz Suslovich... Connie, said Mr Suslovich, poking his head around his office door. I was just coming to look for you. Ah, Connie replied. You're busy right now, are you? Yes. No, Connie said in a neutral sort of voice. I was just on my way to the library, as a matter of... You couldn't do me a favour, could you? It was always the way he said it. You wouldn't expect it to look at him. He had vast shoulders, gigantic round red cheeks, and a dense black beard whose pointed tip brushed against the buckle of his trouser belt. Somehow, however, he managed to sound like a very small child who'd been separated from his parents at a fairground. Cassie stuck, awaiting her with frantic impatience. Sure, she said. What can I do for you? It's his dratted specifications, said Mr Suslovich. And Connie asked herself if she'd ever heard him use coarse language or profane language. Buggered if she knew. Some of it I can understand, but a lot of it's horribly technical. It'd take me a week to look it all up, and even then I probably couldn't make head nor tail of it. Do you think you could possibly... Of course, Connie said brightly. Get Nicky to leave it on my desk, and I'll look at it first thing after lunch. Ah... He could look so sad when he wanted to. Actually, it'd be a tremendous help if you could just cast your eye over it terribly quickly now. I've got the client coming in at 3, you see. Connie thought quickly. Poor stuck Cassie. But stuck, by definition, means not likely to be going anywhere in a hurry. And maybe, just possibly, having to wait an extra 40 minutes might encourage her to look where she was going. The next time. No problem, Connie said, and she thought, just 5 years to go, and then they can all get stuck permanently with or without reams of incomprehensible technical jargon, and it won't be any of my concern. How's your back, by the way? Much better, Mrs. Suslovich replied. My own silly fault, of course. I just can't get used to the fact I'm not able to do the kind of stuff I could handle 20 years ago. He grinned sheepishly. He must have stupendous lip muscles, Connie reflected, in order to lift that bloody great big beard, and held the door for her. One glance at the wodge of single-space typescript reassured Connie that Kaz wasn't just being feeble. It was pretty advanced stuff, all about atomic densities and molecular structures, and she was rather proud of the fact that she could understand it. Explaining it, on the other hand, quite a job you've got on here, she said. New client? Kaz nodded. She managed not to look at the tip of his beard massaging his crotch. Quite a catch if we can keep him happy, he said. Hence the urgency. Connie avoided his gaze. Friends of the new management? She asked, trying and failing to sound casual. Yes and no. She waited a full half-second, then said, and turned her attention back to the technical drivel. Well, she said, it's like this. Imagine the Einsteinian spatial temporal universe is a globe artichoke. Whether or not Kaz really understood what she'd endeavoured to explain to him, he let her go an hour later, thanking her profusely and apologising for taking up so much of her time. That was the infuriating thing about Kaz Suslovich, she thought, as she hurtled toward the front office. There ought to be a law, or something in the European Declaration of Human Rights, about bosses not being allowed to be nice. Went against 1,000 years of tradition in the field of British industrial relations. Of course, she reminded herself as she pushed through the fire door, Kaz Suslovich is nominally Polish. Early lunch, snapped the girl behind the reception desk. She was slight, slim, blue-eyed, red-haired, and to all appearances not a day over 22. She was also Mr. Tanner's mother. Don't talk to me about lunch, Connie counter-snapped. No chance of even a fleeting sandwich, if she had to go and unstick Cassie and be back in the office by 2 p.m. The explanation wasn't, however, something that she could share with her boss's mother. If Tillerson's call, take a message, she added, and lunged out into the street. Poor stuck Cassie, Connie scowled. Impossible, in the circumstances, to take a taxi to Charing Cross and put in a pink expenses chit to get the money back off the firm, which meant that either she'd have to pay for a taxi out of her own money or take the slower but cheaper tube. Well, she thought, Cassie's been there a fair old while already. Another 20 minutes won't kill her. As a stop to her conscience, Connie increased her pace to a swiftish march. New shoes, heel tips not yet ground down to comfortable stubs. Halfway down St. Mary Axe, however, someone called out her name, and she stopped. Connie Schwarzalberich, he repeated. You haven't got a clue who I am, have you? He was short, slim, thin on top, glasses, 50 whatever, button suit, birthday present tie. His voice, however, came straight from somewhere else, long ago, and very far away. It couldn't be. George! He grinned. Voices and grins don't decay the way other externals do. Hellfire, Connie, he said. You haven't changed a bit. Balls, she replied demurely. You have, though. True, he frowned. I was going to say, fancy meeting you here, but... His frown deepened. Don't say you're still stuck at JWW. Yes. My God, he shrugged. Why? Too old to get a decent job, of course. How about you? Still at M&F? He laughed. Not likely, he said. I went freelance, 15 years ago? Got my own consultancy now. Doing all right? I guess so. His grin made it obvious that he was being modest. For over a second and a half, Connie hated him to death. Better than the old days anyhow. Look, is it your lunch hour? Or can you skive off whatever you're doing? Poor Cassie, stuck. On the other hand, George Katzbalger apparently returned from the dead. Oh, go on, she said. Let's go and have a pizza. He looked puzzled. A what? She remembered one of the salient facts about George. You choose, she said. Pleasure. There's this really rather good little Uzbek place just round the corner. Know it? Uzbek? Big bowls of rice with little bits of stuff in it. Yes, all right, but I can't be too long. I've got to go and rescue someone before 1:15 at the latest. George shrugged. No problem, he said. So, he went on, as he fell into step beside her. How long's it been? Since New York. Connie did the maths. 20 years, I suppose, she said. Can't be. My God, he sighed. And you're still with JWW? Is it true, by the way, what I've been hearing? That depends what it is, she said quietly. About the takeover. Ah, she smiled. So what have you been hearing exactly? Yet another salient fact about George. He always knew less than he thought he did about everything. So, over the rice with little bits of stuff in, Connie learned that J.W. Wells & Co., the oldest established firm in its field, had been having a rough time of it lately. 4 of the 7 partners dead or in permanent exile, public confidence shattered, client base uncertain, the corporate hyenas prowling, and had finally succumbed to an aggressive hostile takeover by an undisclosed buyer. Unfortunately, she knew all that already, and George hadn't heard anything else apart from the kind of vague rumours she'd been swapping with the others over coffee. Annoyed, she let George pay for lunch and scuttled off to do whatever it was she'd been on her way to do when she bumped into him. Ah, yes, unstick Cassie. Connie sighed. One damn thing after another. In Mortlake, where the shadows lie, the small family business of Hollingshead and Farron have been making small, intricate brass widgets for the plumbing, heating and hydraulic industries practically since the dawn of time. Put an H&F widget in the hands of a skilled engineer who truly loves his craft and he'll recognise it at once. Most likely he'll comment lovingly on its beautiful lines and exquisite quality of manufacture before pointing out that you can get something nearly as good and made in China for a fifth of the price. Even so, the old firm is still there, pouring, fettling, and machining its small brass miracles. And although the Tharons have long since died out or gone away, the Hollingsheads remain. Father, 2 uncles, 6 cousins, and 1 son. Colin. And when you've done that, Dad said at breakfast, you can nip down to Crinkles and pick up those end mills. Fine, Colin had replied. Can I take the car? No, I'm using it. Walk'll do you good. You can drop in Boots while you're passing and get me some of those heartburn pills. Not for the first time, Colin reflected as he trudged down the high street, collar folded up against the rain, that it really wasn't fair that he didn't have a car of his own anymore. True, the business wasn't doing as well as it should have been, and times were hard, and if he absolutely needed a car for something, he could always borrow the Daimler, if Dad wasn't using it. Even so, he'd been fond of his perky little Datsun, and they'd got next to nothing for it when it was sold. Preoccupied with these reflections, Colin was almost through the door of Boots before he noticed it was Boots no longer. Instead, it at some point turned into a John Menzies. He went in anyway and bought a refill for his pen, a Christmas present from Uncle Phil. It hurt the tip of his middle finger, but you don't want to give offence. That, and a detour to Tesco, who did a practically identical heartburn tablet in slightly different coloured box, explained his late arrival at the meeting, which he'd forgotten all about. It turned out to be the sort of meeting that he'd cheerfully have missed altogether. There was a grim man from the bank, and an equally forbidding-looking woman from the accountants, also some sort of lawyer, and a young woman whose name and function Colin didn't quite catch. But what the hell? From context, he assumed her to be another species of commercial vulture, wheeling by invitation over the moribund carcass at £75 per hour, plus VAT.
The bottom line is, the man from the bank was saying, unless you can find a way to compete with low-cost imports.
Colin tuned out. The same man, or someone very like him, had said the same thing at the same time last year, and the year before that. And just because something's unpleasant and true, it doesn't necessarily mean that it makes for gripping listening. He glanced across the table at the unspecified young woman. Her name, he remembered from the sound of cursory introductions, was Cassandra something, and she was rather nice-looking. Not that that signified, since it's hard to take a romantic interest in a scavenger who's about to strip the residual flesh off your atrophied remains, assuming she was a vulture, of course, but it was probably a safe bet. Unless she was a fabulously wealthy widget collector who wanted 100,067 bees by next Thursday. Chances were she wasn't there to make things better. Odd about boots, he thought. Maybe they're feeling the pinch too. Colin wasn't inclined to take the withering and perishing of H&F personally, since he hadn't been working for the company very long. He'd wanted to go to university and learn to be a vet, but Dad wouldn't hear of it. But he felt sorry for the rest of them. Dad, Uncle Chris, Uncle Phil, the cousins. If Boots was also finishing off its hearty breakfast while the hangman tested the drop mechanism in the prison yard below, at the very least it implied that the hard times were general, and accordingly it wasn't really anybody's fault.
Anyway, said the accountant, that's more or less the position. Unless you can increase turnover by at least 25% over the next 3 months, or else cut costs by 42%.
How old can you be, Colin wondered, and still trained to be a vet? All he really knew about the profession was what he'd gleaned from repeats of All Creatures Great and Small, and the hero in that had been, what, about his age? But you can't tell with actors. Of course, they've got makeup on and all sorts. The careers bloke at school had said he needed all sorts of A-levels and stuff, and that he'd left as soon as he was legally able to do so, and had come here to start at the bottom and work his way up in the customary fashion. As it was, he'd started at the bottom and more or less stayed there, partly through lack of the killer instinct needed to get on in modern commerce, partly because there wasn't anywhere up for him to go until either Dad, Uncle Chris, Uncle Phil, or one of the cousins decided to call it a day. Bit of a waste of time, he couldn't help reflecting, these past few years. His fault? Well, most things proverbially were, but in this case, not everything. If Dad had been a little bit more broad-minded, his life could have been quite different at this point. He could have been standing up to his knees in mud with his arm up a cow's arse, if only he'd been given a decent chance.
I think that's more or less covered everything,
Dad was saying, and Colin couldn't help thinking of a man in a black suit drawing a cloth over the corpse's face.
I think that's more or less covered everything,
Dad was saying, and Colin couldn't help thinking of a man in a black suit drawing a cloth over the corpse's face.
Thank you all for your time, and obviously we'll be in touch as soon as we've reached our decision.
The vultures spread their wings, all except the nice-looking Cassandra female who followed Dad into his office. No summons for Colin to follow, so he wandered slowly back to his own miniature lair, crept in behind the desk. He was slim going on scrawny, but he still had to breathe in, stacked his feet on top of the Albion plastic extrusions file, and allowed himself to slither into a reverie of petulant thought. It was all very well cramming his mental screen with images of Christopher Timothy saving the elderly farmer's beloved sheepdog, but assuming he wasn't ever going to be a vet after all, what was he going to do with his life once Hollinghead and Farron went under? The accountant, he remembered, had been ferociously upbeat about certain aspects of the disaster. The freehold of the factory and warehouse, he'd pointed out, would pay off the debts and redundancies and leave a nice little fat lump sum over to provide for Dad and the uncles in the autumn of their lives. That, however, was more or less it as far as comfort and joy were concerned. The machinery had a modest value as scrap iron, maybe enough to pay the accountant's hourly rate for telling them it was otherwise worthless. The patents were about to expire anyway. The office equipment was a joke, and the best thing to do with the Daimler was leave it parked temptingly in the street and hope a joyrider with an antiquarian bent might take it away and crash it in something solid. The men would be paid off, of course, and that would be that, apart from one loose end, behind whose desk he was currently sitting. Nobody had ventured any suggestions as to what might be done with him. Like it mattered. Colin frowned. As a general rule, he didn't do self-pity. Looked at from another perspective, he was tolerably young, more or less healthy, and not a complete idiot. And after a childhood and early adulthood spent chained to the widget-smith's bench, he was free to do whatever the hell he liked. Not so much a disaster, therefore, as an opportunity in fuck-up's clothing. Opportunity. He considered the concept objectively. To date, opportunities had mostly been things offered to Colin via email by benevolent Nigerian lawyers. Otherwise, he had always followed a path ordained for him by those who knew better, and a pretty narrow track it had been, running straight through a small and circumscribed world, consisting mostly of rather boring work and running errands for senior family members. There had always been an undeniable logic to it all, of course. Why should he want to move out to a place of his own when the family home was only a minute's walk from the factory gate? What did he need a car for? What conceivable purpose would be served by him spending a year backpacking around the Andes, given that the entire Latin American widget market was sewn up by the big US manufacturers? Furthermore, whence had he got the curious idea that he had time to go running around after girls when there were inventories to be made and quality to be controlled? Over the years, widget making had been held up to him as a combination of Holy Grail, family curse, and closed monastic order. Without it, the world would be a big, strange, interesting place, even if his role in it was as yet poorly defined. Besides, he shifted his feet, nudging Albion plastic extrusions off the desk and onto the floor. It was by no means certain that the old firm was even dead yet. This time last year, they'd been squinting down the twin barrels of an empty order book and a catastrophic tax demand. Then, just as the doctor's finger had been quivering over the life support machine's off switch, some lunatic in Newport Pagnell had bespoken 250,000 J778C30s. Payment 50% in advance, and in due course he'd paid for and taken delivery of his widgets, and nobody had seen or heard of him again. If there was one such loopy philanthropist in the world, why not another? Maybe even now he was stuffing a cheque into an envelope, a crazed look on his face, and a lampshade balanced on top of his head in place of a hat. Enough about that, then. Colin let the unruly Highland terrier of his mind off the lead, and let it chase pigeons through the bushes of more enticing improbabilities. The nice-looking female that met him, for instance. When the other suits had buggered off to shake their heads and pad their bills, she'd stayed behind to talk to the old man. What was she then? Some business school whiz-kid or efficiency guru come to set them all to rights? Hadn't looked the type, although Colin freely conceded that he hadn't a clue what the type was supposed to look like. Not a customer, or we wouldn't be giving her a guided tour of the dirty laundry. For the same reasons, not a creditor. So, apart from clients, people they owe money to, and charcoal grey card leeches, who the hell else did they know? Nobody. Not that he'd have spared her 1% of a passing thought if she hadn't been nice-looking. A realist in matters of self-appraisal, Colin was well aware that he was both shallow, he preferred uncomplicated, and unregenerate when it came to nice-looking. Not that he got much chance to be either in and around the widget trade, where people tended to be male, middle-aged, harassed-looking, and generally sad. Even 5 years ago, things had been rather more lively. Now, however, his friends from school were mostly paired off and domesticated, and his social life had accordingly dwindled down to this, surreptitiously ogling nice-looking lady scavengers over the raised lid of his briefcase. He frowned. Maybe H&F going down the bog wouldn't be such a bad thing after all, if it meant that he'd be turned loose in a rather more varied society. "Oh, brave new world," he said to himself, "that have living, unmutilated females under 45 in it." Slowly but surely, he thought, "I'm turning into a real mess." Note to self, do something about that before it's too late. At some point, Colin looked up at the clock on the opposite wall and saw that it was gone 6. He sat up. Brooding morosely on his own time was something he tried to avoid. True, he had nowhere much to go apart from home, but even he, indentured servant of a family business, had some rudimentary grasp of the great work-fun dichotomy that informs the whole of modern Western civilization. If it was after hours, it was time he buggered off. He went home. An old-fashioned, rather shiny brown trilby hat on the hook in the hall. For once, Dad was home before him. Colin hung up his coat next to the hat and drifted into the front room. Mum was there, reading a magazine. She didn't look up as she came into the room, but the cat lifted her head and gave him her trademark scowl of disappointed contempt. The TV was on as usual, with the sound turned down. You could tell it was autumn by the small drift of yellow leaves nestling around the foot of the massive tree that grew in the exact centre of the room. "When's dinner?" he asked. "Don't know," Mum replied, eyes glued to the print. "What do you want?" "What is there?" She thought for a moment. "Fish fingers," she said, "or chicken Kievs. You could open a tin for Gretchen while you're out there." Colin nodded and set course for the kitchen. For Gretchen the cat, he opened a can of chicken fillets and gravy. He made himself cheese on toast. The ad hoc catering implied that Dad was having something on a tray in his study. Figures to pore over, books to fiddle, whatever. Just as well. Colin didn't feel like an evening of painfully synthesised conversation in front of the muted telly. Then to bed. He'd got the latest John Grisham from the library a day or so back, but for once the poet's magic was failing to enthrall him. He read the same paragraph 3 times, stuck a switch receipt in it for a bookmark and laid it by. He wasn't sleepy, but he turned out the light anyway and closed his eyes. Lying in the dark, he fancied he could hear voices. Not a Joan of Arc moment necessarily, because Dad's study was in the loft conversion directly overhead, and one of the voices could well be the old man's rumbling growl. The other one sounded feminine, but he couldn't make out any more than that. The nice-looking female, he thought, and then the stream of his consciousness flowed out into the delta of drowsiness. He fell asleep, and so presumably what followed was a dream. There was this girl for a start. Annoyingly, Colin couldn't see her face. Either it was turned away from him or masked from view by the stupid great big hat she was wearing for some reason. But apparently he knew who she was. In fact, as far as he could make out, he was in love with her, and, yes, definitely a dream, although somehow it felt more like a memory, she was in love with him. They were strolling beside a river, up and down which young men in straw hats were propelling ditzy-looking boats by means of long wet sticks. He wished that his dream viewpoint allowed him to get a good look at the clothes he was wearing, because he had a feeling they were strange and old-fashioned, like the clobber the girl had on. Curious. He had to flounder about in the very back of his subconscious mind before he realised that it was straight out of Mary Poppins, a film he'd slept through once many years ago. If the mental pictures he was creating for himself had been reflux through the hiatus hernia of memory, it was an intriguing comment on his jackdaw mind. Minutiae of female costume had never interested him in the least, but he was prepared to bet good money that the outfit the girl was wearing was historically accurate down to the last frill and button, although when the historical period thus faithfully created was, he had no idea. Not, of course, that it really mattered. The unusual and arresting feature of this dream, surely, was the girl who actually liked him back, in spite of having known him for more than 10 minutes. It got better. He couldn't see her face, of course, or maybe she looked like a Springer Spaniel under all that hat, but she had a lovely voice and a wonderful sense of humour. She hadn't said anything funny yet, but apparently that was part of the backstory, and it was obvious that just being in her company was the most wonderful thing ever. Here was a girl you could talk to all day and never realise the time was passing. A girl who saw the world in a wonderfully refreshing, different way. A girl he was enchanted by and absolutely at home with at the same time. Fine. It was just a dream, and even at its best, real life isn't ever like that, and if it was, 10 minutes of it would be enough to make you want to throw up. Nevertheless, it wasn't at all like his usual kind of dream. For one thing, he wasn't trying to play the cello with no clothes on in front of an audience of his relations, enemies, and former headmasters. For another, he never had dreams about girls. One of the ditzy-looking boats pulled into the bank, and its passengers climbed out. Ah, he thought, that's more like it. Goblins. Normal service has been resumed. We apologise for any inconvenience. But the goblins simply strolled past, chatting pleasantly among themselves, pausing very briefly to tip their hats politely to him in a charmingly old-fashioned, courteous kind of way. He reciprocated. The goblins went on their way, chatting about the century that Fry had just made at the Oval. Century? That was cricket, wasn't it? Colin despised cricket, much as a cat relates badly to water. Arguably, that made sense within the dream's own frame of reference. He didn't like goblins much either, not that he'd ever encountered one, because of course there's no such thing. So it kind of followed that they'd like a game that gave him a pain in the bum. Dream logic. So that was all right. "Let's sit down on the bench," the girl was saying, "and feed the ducks." There was a bench. There were ducks. In his hand he discovered a brown paper bag full of little bits of stale bread. Don't feed ducks bread. Anyway, I return to the story. Bloody odd dream, since he didn't like ducks much either. Colin opened the bag and offered it to her. She took a handful of stale bits and hurled them daintily onto the surface of the water. The ducks closed in, like cruisers cornering the Bismarck. So far, apparently, so idyllic. But then she turned her face toward him. Didn't he know her from somewhere? No, but her face was completely familiar all the same, and looked him in the eye. That made her uncomfortable. She looked away, folded her hands in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she said, "about us." Two ducks were racing for the nearest chunk of floating bread. One of them, mottled brown, beat the other, sort of blue-greeny-grey, by a short head. "Oh, yes," he said. Stupid thing to say. "Yes," she said, and hesitation. Her voice wobbled a bit as she said, "And I don't think it's going to work, you and me. I mean, I just don't think we're right for each other."
"Not to worry, only a dream. Cheese on toast before going to bed." "You can't mean that,"
he heard himself say. "I'm sorry," she replied. "In a dream, the people speak, but you hear the words inside your head. I suppose I've known it for some time now, but I pretended it wasn't true. I thought I could make it work, but I can't. I'm just not the person you think I am. And if all of this was cribbed straight out of Mary Poppins along with the sets and costumes, it must have been one of the bits that he'd slept through, because it didn't ring any bells at all."
"That's simply not true,"
he was saying, hurt, incredulous, angry.
"We get on so well together. I never felt this with anybody else, and I know you feel the same, really. You must just be—"
"No." A passing goblin turns to stare, then looks away hurriedly in embarrassment. "No, we've got to stop lying to ourselves. It only makes it worse. We've got to face it. We can't go on like this anymore. It's just wishful thinking. If I could make myself love you, I would. But I can't, and that's all there is to it." On balance, Colin decided, he preferred the cello-playing dream, even the version with the goblins and the pack of red-eyed howling wolves. At any rate, this would be a good moment for him to wake up, bolt upright, bathed in sweat, tangle of bedclothes and a white-knuckle grip. "Please?"
"I don't know what to say,"
he replied, perfectly truthfully.
"This is such a bolt from the blue. I thought, damn it, we're supposed to be getting married in a fortnight's time. A dream with plot twists, sophisticated or what? We've made all the arrangements. What am I going to tell my parents?"
"I said I'm sorry," she was saying. "I know, it's my fault. I should have said something before now. I should have known it'd upset you dreadfully. Maybe that's why I kept putting it off, because I really don't want to hurt you. But you can see, can't you?"
"No."
Colin opened his eyes. He was sitting bolt upright, all sweaty, hands gripping the duvet cover. It took him several seconds to make sure that he wasn't still sitting on a bench beside a river, feeding disgusting ducks. Once he was sure that he was safely back in reality, he switched on the light and hopped out of bed. No sound of voices coming through the ceiling. He checked the time. midnight. He padded up the stairs, past the upper section of tree trunk that filled the stairwell, and paused for a moment outside Dad's study door, looking for the crack of light that meant the old man was still in there. Then he knocked and went in. "Dad," he said, "you know about cricket and stuff. Was there a cricket player called Fry?" Dad frowned.
"C.B. Fry," he replied. "Very famous Edwardian batsman. What about him?"
"Nothing," Colin replied. "Night." He got as far as the landing, turned round and knocked again. "Dad?"
"Well?"
"Is there any, insanity in our family? People not right in the head and stuff?" Dad raised his eyebrows.
"Before you mean?"
"Yes."
"No."
"Ah," Colin said. "That's good. Well, see you in the morning." Back out onto the landing. One step down the stairs. Hesitate. Back up again. Knock.
"Now what?"
"Dad."
"Well?"
Pause. "Why have we got a bloody great big tree growing up through the middle of our house, and why can't you see the top of it from outside?" Dad scowled at him.
"Go back to bed,"
he said.
"You need to be up early in the morning."
I hope you enjoyed chapter 1 of You Don't Have to Be Evil to Work Here, but it helps. Please hit the like button if you do enjoy it. Hit the notifications bell if you want to hear about new chapters. And I'm always happy to hear any feedback that you've got in the comments, any suggestions, or even just to say hello. So, hopefully going to be doing these every other day past 6 o'clock in the evening, GMT. And of course, let me know where you're from. Let me know which area of the world that you're listening from, because I'm always interested. So chapter 2 will be coming up in a couple of days, should be by the 11th of January. And thank you for indulging me whiffling on in my chapters, because I'm trying to add a little bit of nuance, because there's no AI around here. Big love, thanks for listening, and